I dealt with measuring stud heights and dealing with the different changes in the studs or the basement ceiling height that you're going to have as you progress through your project. So now we're going to be ready to take measurements for our studs. In this case here with the closet, I'm just going to pretend like we're making a regular wall. You can apply this to any wall. I'm actually going to have a door frame here. I'm going to have 2 jack studs and king studs, but I'm just going to measure like I was measuring for any other studs. There's a couple ways to do this when you're working in a basement and you have uneven floor, maybe even an uneven overhead space. If you're building a wall and you're doing new construction, you're building everything square and level, you basically cut all your studs the same size, build your walls, and stack up from there. In a basement here, you're going to have a couple things playing against you. The floor joists up overhead should be generally level, assuming that your floor overhead is level. You can have a situation where that floor isn't necessarily level or even, and maybe your floor joists are at a bit of different height themselves. In this case, in this construction, this floor and the joists above are generally fairly level to each other all the way down. The floor, however, though, we've got 2 things going on. We're working off of an original concrete floor. First, because we're in a basement, the concrete floor is actually pitched towards the drainage or the sump pump. So the entire floor is actually going from a place of a higher elevation on one end, on the opposite corner of the foundation from the sump pump, and going to a point of lower end over by the sump. You also may have a little bit of uneven level in the floor itself, depending on how the concrete was poured, where the seams are located. You may have a couple high spots. So you've got several things you're working with. I've got 2 examples here of walls that I built along the perimeter of my work here, and I've built them in 2 different ways. There's 2 ways we can cut the studs. We can measure to the lowest point, or the highest point I should say, on the floor, or the relative lowest point at the ceiling that you're going to connect to, and then cut all the studs evenly. What might happen though then is you might be at a different height at each one of these locations where your header plate is going to be. In this case, with this wall, I did exactly that. I made all of the studs exactly the same length from the high point. And you can see here at this stud, this is where the high point of the floor or the low point of the ceiling allowed my top plate to meet right at the bottom of this joist. But as we go along, you can see that we've got some increasing gaps at each of the next joists. So here you can see a little bit of a gap there, and the gap increasing as we go. So what we do in this case, and I left a shim here, but what I've done is I'll shim to the gap and then drill or nail or screw up through the top plate and the shim. Now I've broken off the shims at each of these other locations, but I have shimmed at each of these places and then nailed or screwed through that top plate. So it's a little bit more of a pain in the butt and work that way to have to shim to get the connection. Now the alternative way, as I've done here, and you can see the difference actually between the height of this top plate and the height of this top plate. And I did this intentionally to show the difference between measuring the studs to each of the joists. So here I've measured as we went along, and now our floor in this case is sloping gradually downward this way. So the height of the studs is getting longer as we move along. So in this case, it's a little bit more of a pain in the butt to first take all your measurements, get all your measurements at each joist, and then cut your studs a different length each one. It's just a little bit of a change once you're at your saw, adjusting it in this case by an 1/8 inch or roughly an eighth inch each one. And now you can see that the top plate is nice and flush against the joists. Here you can see the difference between the 2 walls that I built in the 2 different ways, and I left it this way intentionally to show. So on the right hand side we have the top plate that is sloping downward with studs that are all cut to the same length. So our top plate is therefore sloping downward with an increasing gap along each of the joists that we're shimming and then drilling or screwing or nailing up into the joists. And on this case, our studs are cut to the appropriate length at each joist, and therefore the top plate is flush, so we have to do a little extra work cutting our studs. But then once we build our wall, it fits up nice and flush against the ceiling. Now frankly, that's the way I prefer to do it. I'd rather do a little extra work on the cutting side and not have to worry about shimming, and that's the way I worked the rest of the project. So now we've measured and cut all our studs. In this case, the floor is sloping a little bit downward that way, so each stud is progressively an 1/8 inch longer. Measured from the 2 plates up to the joist, you can see now I've got with my 2 joists and the studs, I'm going to be right at the height that I need for each of these to slide this wall, right underneath the end of those studs. So now we'll build our wall.